September 1st, 1943. The skies over Marcus Island, Central Pacific. Japanese Zero pilots are about to meet an aircraft they have never seen before, and the encounter will change everything they thought they knew about this war. The Americans attacking Marcus Island on September 1st, 1943, are from carrier air groups that the Japanese pilots intercepting them have encountered in various forms since Pearl Harbor. The carrier strikes themselves are not new. The tactics are recognizable. What is not recognizable is the fighter covering the bombers, a large dark blue barrel-bodied aircraft that the Zero pilots pulling up to intercept identify in the first seconds as something categorically different from the Grumman Wildcats they have been killing since 1942. The aircraft is bigger than any American carrier fighter they have encountered, bigger than the Wildcat, bigger than the P-40S that Army Air Force pilots have been flying in land-based Pacific operations. It's Pratt and Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, an 18-cylinder twin-row radial that produces 2,000 horsepower, gives it a frontal profile that Japanese pilots accustomed to the lean, narrow cowl of the Zero find almost ungainly, a blunt-nosed barrel of an aircraft that should not, by any intuitive reading of its proportions, be as fast or as agile as it is turning out to be. It is faster in level flight, perceptibly faster, even in the first seconds of the engagement, in a way that tells the Zero pilots attempting to position for their attacks that the engagement geometry they normally control, the ability to be where they choose to be at the speed they choose to be at, forcing the opponent to react to their decisions rather than vice versa, is not going to be available to them in the way it has been against every previous American fighter. It climbs at angles that the pilots attempting to intercept it find disorienting, because the angles exceed what Japanese assessments of American carrier fighter performance had projected as achievable for a carrier-capable design of this size, and because the climbing aircraft is also maneuvering, also aware of the Zeros trying to cut it off from above, also being flown by a pilot who understands his aircraft's energy management well enough to trade speed for altitude and altitude for position with a fluency that the Zero pilots who have spent years developing that fluency in their own aircraft find, in the specific and involuntary way that one professional recognizes competence in another, genuinely impressive. And when the first Zero pilots attempt the standard head-on or quarter attack that has worked reliably against the Wildcat since the opening months of the war, the attack that relies on closing speed and deflection angle, and the Zero's specific advantage in climb rate to place its 20mm cannon and 7.7mm machine guns in a geometrically favorable position where a short burst will produce either a kill or a damaged aircraft that can be finished on the next pass. The aircraft they are attacking does not respond the way the Wildcat does. The Wildcat, when attacked from a favorable angle, has generally attempted to turn toward the attack and accept the defensive turning engagement, a response that experienced Zero pilots have learned to exploit through the slow, grinding spiral that uses the Zero's superior turn radius to tighten the geometry until a solution is available. The F6F does not do this. It does not attempt to turn with them in the slow, defensive circle that experienced Zero pilots have learned to work against. It does something that experienced Zero pilots have not seen an American carrier fighter do before. It dives, converting the altitude of the engagement into speed with the specific efficiency that a 2,000 horsepower engine provides, and it accelerates away from the engagement at a speed that the Zero's 950 horsepower cannot match in a dive where engine power rather than aerodynamic loading determines who goes faster. It accelerates away from the engagement with an energy that the Zero's engine, at this altitude and in these atmospheric conditions, cannot match. And it climbs back, repositioning above the engagement, with a rate of climb that the Zero pilots observing it from below find, in the specific professional language that fighter pilots use to describe aircraft performance in the middle of a fight, impossible. The aircraft is the Grumman F6F Hellcat, conceived in the specific failure of every American carrier fighter that has preceded it and built in the Grumman plant at Bethpage, New York, by workers who are assembling it faster than any previous American carrier aircraft has been assembled, because the Navy's production contracts have been structured to make speed of delivery as important as quality of design. The men who return from the Marcus Island engagement to write their reports to the Japanese Naval Air Force Command, and who write in the private letters home that the Japanese military censorship system screens with varying thoroughness and does not always fully suppress, are writing about the specific moment when the tactical superiority that Japanese carrier aviation has maintained since Pearl Harbor ends. They are writing about it as professionals, as men who have been flying combat missions for years and who understand the aircraft they are flying and the aircraft they are fighting with the specific clarity that survival in combat demands, and they are writing about it in a form and through a system that ensures their most honest assessments will be seen by the smallest possible number of people who need to understand what they are describing. The censorship that screens their letters home removes the most operationally specific content. The classification system that processes their official reports restricts the most damaging assessments to a handful of officers at headquarters. And so, the information that Japanese pilots are providing about the Hellcat, accurate information, professionally produced, urgently important, moves through a system that has been designed not to convey accurate information upward, but to manage the information that reaches the leadership in a form that the leadership can accommodate without acknowledging the implications. The letters they write and the reports they file are not, for the most part, available through any single document, release, or classified archive that a researcher can go to today and read in a single organized collection. They exist in the fragmentary record of survivor testimony, post-war interviews with Japanese naval aviators, and the operational records of Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force units that American intelligence captured, translated, and analyzed. What they consistently say across this fragmented record is the same thing. The Zero's edge is gone, the American pilots have something we cannot match, and we do not know how long we can sustain what follows from that fact. The F6F Hellcat entered the Pacific War in August 1943 with a developmental story that is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential examples of institutional learning under combat pressure in the entire history of aviation. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had designed the Hellcat in response to the operational experience of the Grumman F4F Wildcat in the Pacific War's opening year, experience that had been brutal in its clarity. The Wildcat was outclimbed by the Zero. It was outturned by the Zero. It was slower than the Zero at most combat altitudes. American fighter pilots flying it survived by exploiting the specific advantages that combat analysis had identified. The Wildcat's greater structural strength, its ability to dive faster than the Zero, whose control surfaces stiffened dramatically at high indicated airspeed in ways that prevented the Zero pilot from reversing direction or pulling out of a dive without risking structural failure, and the weight of its .50 caliber machine guns that, while fewer in number than the Hellcat would eventually carry, fired a heavier round than the Zero's 7.7 millimeter weapons, and could inflict damage that the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks and unarmored cockpit were catastrophically vulnerable to. The Thatch Weave, the coordinated defensive maneuver that Lieutenant Commander John Thatch had developed in simulated combat exercises in January 1942 and validated in combat at Midway in June of that year, specifically for the Wildcat's limitations, a maneuver that required two pairs of fighters to cross toward each other whenever either pair was attacked, ensuring that any Zero following one pair into the cross found itself in the sights of the oncoming pair, kept competent American pilots alive in Wildcats that no amount of individual skill could make the equal of a Zero, in a one-on-one turning fight. The tactic worked. It kept pilots alive. It also required a level of trust and coordination between pairs that the stress and chaos of combat made difficult to sustain consistently. And it was, in the analysis of every American fighter aviator who had been forced to use it, a defensive maneuver, one that prevented loss rather than creating opportunity, that preserved pilots rather than enabling the kind of aggressive, offensive fighter combat that American doctrine wanted its pilots to conduct. The competent tactics compensated for an inferior aircraft rather than solving the problem. The solution required a new aircraft. The Hellcat was built from the specific combat lessons that Grumman engineers received through an intensive feedback loop between American carrier squadrons in the Pacific and the design team in Bethpage, New York. A feedback loop that was formalized through the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics and accelerated by the specific intelligence bonanza that the recovery of a nearly intact Zero at Akutan Island in the Aleutians in July 1942 had provided. The 210 Zero, recovered by a Navy salvage team and rebuilt to flying condition at North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, was test flown against every American fighter type then in production in a systematic evaluation that produced, for the first time, a complete and precise technical picture of the Zero's performance envelope, its turn radius at various speeds, its climb rate, its top speed, its control behavior at high indicated airspeed, its structural limitations, and the specific altitudes and speeds at which it was most and least dangerous to an adversary. The evaluation confirmed what combat experience had been suggesting, that the Zero's advantages were concentrated in the slow speed, low altitude turning fight, and that at high speeds its advantages disappeared and its structural and control limitations became genuine liabilities. The Hellcat was designed around this knowledge, shaped by engineers who knew precisely what Japanese aircraft they needed to defeat, and who had, for the first time, the technical data to design against it, rather than guessing from combat observation. The feedback loop between the Bethpage design team and American carrier squadrons in the Pacific produced, in approximately 18 months from design authorization to combat deployment, an aircraft that addressed every specific disadvantage that the Wildcat had demonstrated against the Zero, in a package that Grumman's industrial efficiency delivered at the rate of 12,275 airframes before the war's end. By comparison, Japan produced approximately 10,600 Zeros of all variants across the entire war, and the Zero that was rolling off Japanese production lines in 1943 and 1944 was essentially the same aircraft that had appeared over Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The Hellcat that appeared over Marcus Island in September 1943 was something genuinely new. The specific performance characteristics that Japanese pilots encountered in their first engagements with the Hellcat were not individual achievements in any single dimension of performance. The Zero remained superior to the Hellcat in turn radius at medium speeds and altitudes. This advantage, built into the Zero's design through the deliberate elimination of structural weight that made the aircraft dangerously fragile at high speeds, was never eliminated, and Japanese pilots who could get an F6F into a slow speed turning engagement could still exploit it through the war's final months. What the Hellcat delivered was a combination of characteristics that the Zero could not match simultaneously: an engine producing over 2,000 horsepower against the Zero's 950, a maximum speed of 611 kilometers per hour against the Zero's 533, a climb rate at combat altitudes that matched the Zero's, while carrying armor plate behind the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that the Zero's design had specifically eliminated to achieve its turning performance. The pilot who flew a Hellcat could be hit by a 7.7 millimeter machine gun round through his fuel tank and continue fighting, because the self-sealing compounds in the tank walls suppressed the fire that would have killed him in a Zero. The pilot who flew a Zero through a burst of the Hellcat 6.50 caliber machine guns received the fire into an aircraft specifically designed with no provision for either pilot protection or fuel fire suppression, on the calculated pre-war assumption that an aircraft as agile as the Zero would never need those provisions because no opponent would ever place it in a position where they mattered. By September 1943, that assumption was wrong. September 1943 through February 1944. Japanese Naval Air Force operational records from this period, captured by American forces during various island operations and translated and analyzed by naval intelligence teams in Hawaii, document a pattern that unit commanders begin noting in their reports with increasing urgency across these months. Zero pilots engaging F6F Hellcats are suffering losses at ratios that reverse the exchange rates that Japanese carrier aviation had maintained through 1942. In the Rabaul air battles of late October and November 1943, when Admiral Menechi Koga's attempt to reinforce Rabaul with carrier air groups from the 3rd Fleet, 173 aircraft drawn from the carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Zuiho, the survivors of the Pearl Harbor strike force, and the best trained air groups remaining in the Japanese carrier force, produces a series of engagements against American carrier air groups from Task Force 38 that are flying Hellcats. The Japanese unit commanders who survive file reports that Japanese naval headquarters in Tokyo receives and classifies at high security levels, not because the contents are surprising, but because they are confirming with operational precision and specific loss figures a trend that headquarters has been tracking for 2 months and has not yet found an operational response to. The Rabaul battles consume approximately 86 Japanese carrier aircraft in a month of fighting over and around Rabaul Harbor, an attrition rate that leaves the 3rd Fleet's carrier air groups depleted beyond their ability to sustain offensive carrier operations for the foreseeable future. The operational consequence is that Japan's strongest remaining carrier air groups, the men who were supposed to be the core of the Mobile Fleet's air striking power for the expected major carrier engagement that Japanese naval strategy was still premised on winning, have been spent in a land-based air campaign over Rabaul that has achieved no decisive result and has cost Japan the trained pilots it needed for the decisive battle that Koga's plan was still trying to set up. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Mori, commanding one of the air groups committed to the Rabaul reinforcement, files a report in November 1943 that later analyzed Japanese records show was reviewed at the level of the Naval Aviation Bureau and the Naval General Staff. The report describes engagements against Hellcats in terms that, translating the professional language of a Japanese naval aviator with a decade of experience, can be rendered as a statement that the Zero is no longer the dominant aircraft in the engagement, that American fighters are now capable of dictating the terms of the engagement in ways they were not capable of in 1942, and that the pilots available to fly Japanese aircraft are not equivalent in experience or skill to the pilots who flew them at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway. The third observation is as important as the first two. The Hellcat has arrived at exactly the moment when Japanese naval aviation is most vulnerable to an aircraft that can exploit the gaps the Zero's limitations have always contained, but that previous American aircraft could never exploit because their own limitations were equivalent or greater. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th, 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots name it in the immediate aftermath, is the engagement that confirms everything that the Marcus Island encounter and the Rabaul battles have been suggesting. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Mobile Fleet launches 373 aircraft in 4 waves against Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58. a carrier striking force of 15 carriers organized into 4 task groups and flying approximately 475 Hellcats as its primary fighter defense. The American Fighter Direction System, radar-controlled combat air patrol coordination that by June 1944 has been refined through 2 years of development into a mechanism capable of intercepting incoming Japanese aircraft before they reach the fleet with a consistency that no previous naval defense has achieved. Vectors, Hellcats, against each Japanese wave at sufficient altitude and distance from the fleet that the engagement occurs on American terms rather than Japanese terms. The Japanese aircraft arrive at their target altitude to find Hellcats already above them. They attempt to maneuver into the engagement. The Hellcats dive, fire, and climb back to altitude with an energy exchange that the Zero cannot match because the Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower gives it the energy management to reposition above the engagement repeatedly without losing the altitude advantage that determines who is attacking and who is defending. The Japanese pilots who have been flying long ferry missions from their carriers before entering combat arrive at the engagement with reduced fuel and reduced options, fighting an aircraft that has fuel to spare and options that their own aircraft's performance no longer allows them to restrict. Of 373 Japanese aircraft launched in 4 waves across the day, 243 are shot down by Hellcats or anti-aircraft fire. American losses are 29 aircraft. 3 Japanese carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hiyo, are sunk during the operation by American submarines and Hellcat-escorted dive bombers. The specific texture of the day's air combat is documented in the after-action reports of both sides. American fighter directors aboard the carriers using radar to vector Hellcat combat air patrols against each Japanese wave at altitudes and distances that ensured American pilots had the altitude advantage before the engagement began, while Japanese pilots who had flown the transit from their carriers before entering combat arrived already partially depleted of the fuel and energy that proper management of the engagement required. Individual Hellcat pilots file claims in the debriefs that evening that range from 1 to 7 confirmed kills for the day. Pilots like Commander David McCampbell, commanding Air Group 15 aboard the Essex, who claims 7 kills in a single day's fighting and will end the war as the American Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed aerial victories, all of them in Hellcats. The Japanese pilots who survived the 4 waves and returned to their carriers, approximately 130 of the 373 who launched, returned to fleets that are anchored by the day's losses, in a strategic position from which no subsequent operation can recover the initiative that the Philippine Sea has permanently transferred to the American side. The exchange ratio of the entire engagement, measured in aircraft, in pilots, in the cumulative skill and experience that each pilot represents, is so unfavorable to Japan that the Naval Aviation Command in Tokyo, receiving the action reports in the days following the battle, faces a number that its existing planning frameworks cannot meaningfully process. The mobile fleet's air groups, trained for months and committed as Japan's primary offensive naval striking force, have been reduced to combat ineffectiveness in a single day. The near failure that threatens to prevent even this disaster's full significance from being processed comes in the behavior of the Japanese Naval Aviation Command in the months between September 1943 and June 1944, specifically in the decision to continue committing pilot classes to combat before completing their training, in the belief that operational experience would supplement training gaps in a way that was producing exactly the opposite result. Pilots who were being killed by Hellcats they had not been adequately trained to survive, whose deaths consumed the training pipeline that might have produced replacement pilots with sufficient skill to narrow the competency gap that the Hellcat had opened. The Japanese Naval Aviation Training Program of 1942 had produced pilots who flew 300 to 500 hours before their first combat assignment. a training standard that was itself a reduction from the pre-war standard, which had been even more demanding, reflecting the recognition by Japanese naval aviation planners that the quantity of trained pilots available would need to increase to sustain the expansion of carrier aviation that the Pacific War's operational requirements demanded. By 1943, the program had been further compressed to approximately 200 hours, a reduction that the attrition of Midway and the Solomons campaign had made arithmetically necessary, but that also represented a qualitative degradation in pilot skill that every experienced Japanese naval aviation officer understood, and that very few were in a position to publicly acknowledge. By 1944, the program was producing combat-assigned pilots with 100 hours or fewer in men who had mastered the basic mechanics of flying a Zero, but who had not accumulated the specific experience in aerial combat maneuvering, energy management, and situational awareness under the stress of actual combat that the difference between an aircraft's performance envelope and a pilot's ability to use it fully represents. These men, encountering Hellcats over the Marianas for the first time, were not equipped by their training to exploit the Zero's remaining advantages against a Hellcat, the slow speed turn fight that required experienced management of the combat energy envelope to set up in conditions where the Hellcat pilot was actively working to prevent it, and were correspondingly being killed at rates that the training pipeline, itself compressed by the same attrition that was consuming the more experienced pilots its graduates were replacing, could not arrest. These men, encountering Hellcats over Rabaul or the Marianas for the first time, were not equipped by their training to exploit the Zero's remaining advantages against a Hellcat, the slow speed turn fight that required experienced management of the combat energy envelope to set up successfully, and were correspondingly being killed at rates that the training pipeline could not replace. The F6F Hellcat had not merely matched the Zero's performance in combat relevant parameters. By arriving when it did and performing as it did, it had set in motion an attrition dynamic that Japanese naval aviation could not arrest within the constraints of its training and production systems. What Japanese pilots who survived these early Hellcat encounters wrote home, and what they said in the private conversations within their squadrons that fellow aviators later documented in post-war testimony to Japanese military historians and to the teams of American intelligence officers who debriefed captured Japanese aviation personnel throughout the war and in its immediate aftermath, is preserved in a record that is fragmentary, partial, and filtered through multiple layers of selection and suppression. The official Japanese wartime censorship system, administered through the military postal service, screened private correspondence from serving personnel for defeatist content, information that might be useful to enemy intelligence, and statements that contradicted official military communications about the war's progress. Letters that contained any of these elements were confiscated, and in some cases used as the basis for internal investigations of the writer's loyalty and commitment. The system was not perfect. No censorship system at the scale required to screen the correspondence of millions of service personnel can be, and letters that contained coded or indirect expressions of concern about the war's trajectory sometimes reach their destinations. But the overall effect of the censorship system, combined with the social and cultural pressures that Japanese military culture placed on the expression of doubt, was to produce a body of private correspondence from Japanese pilots that is systematically incomplete as a record of what those men actually thought and felt about the tactical situations they were encountering. What remains? In the letters that were delivered and preserved by their recipients, in the testimony of surviving pilots recorded after the war, in the operational reports that American intelligence translated and analyzed, is consistent enough across enough independent sources to support the reconstruction of the core message, but the substance of what they communicated in the letters that were delivered and in the conversations that their surviving fellow aviators preserved in post-war testimony is consistent enough across the available sources to reconstruct with reasonable confidence. They wrote that the American aircraft was fast. They wrote that it climbed in ways the Zero could not follow. They wrote that it was flown by pilots who understood its strengths and who fought it differently than American pilots had fought before, not attempting to turn with the Zero, which experienced Japanese pilots had always been able to exploit, but fighting from altitude and speed in a way that converted the Hellcat's power and structural strength into tactical advantages that the Zero's agility could not effectively counter. Some of them wrote in the circumspect language that Japanese military culture and wartime censorship together imposed on private communication, that the situation in the air was changing in ways that the official communications from naval headquarters were not accurately describing. None of them wrote despair, at least not in any letter that reached its destination and was subsequently preserved. Japanese military culture and the specific social structure of naval aviation units provided too many constraints on the expression of defeatism to allow that. But the gap between what they wrote and what their commanders were telling headquarters, and the gap between what headquarters was telling the public and what the combat record was demonstrating to any analyst with access to the actual loss figures, is one of the war's most consequential information management failures, because it prevented the Japanese government and Japanese public from developing the accurate understanding of the war's trajectory that might have led to an earlier negotiated end to a conflict that was already decided by the spring of 1944. By the end of the Pacific War in August 1945, American naval pilots flying F6F Hellcats had recorded 5,163 confirmed aerial kills, more than any other Allied aircraft type in any theater, against a total American loss of approximately 270 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. The lifetime kill-to-loss ratio of the Hellcat in Pacific combat is approximately 19-1, a figure that represents not merely the advantage of one aircraft over another, but the cumulative product of American industrial capacity, accelerated flight training, the Akuten Zero and the specific technical intelligence it provided, and the fundamental strategic reality that the United States could replace every pilot and every aircraft the war consumed and Japan could not. The Hellcat was the instrument through which that strategic reality was expressed in the air over the Pacific. It was designed to solve the specific problems that the Zero had demonstrated, built with the specific understanding of the Zero's capabilities that American intelligence and combat analysis had developed and produced in numbers that Japanese aviation could not match. But the numbers and the performance alone do not fully explain the Hellcat's impact on the men who flew against it. What the Japanese pilots who survived their first Hellcat engagements wrote and said and communicated across the fragmented record available to historians is not primarily a technical assessment. It is a recognition expressed in the specific professional language of men who had spent years at the apex of their craft, that the war in the air had changed, that the advantage they had built and maintained and trained for was gone, and that the replacement for it was not going to come from any improvement in their aircraft or any adjustment in their tactics. It was going to have to come from somewhere that no tactical adjustment or aircraft modification could provide. It was going to have to come from the will to continue fighting an enemy that had solved the problem of the Zero before anyone in Japan had been publicly willing to acknowledge that the Zero had a problem worth solving. The Hellcat did not end the Pacific Air War by itself. The war ended because of the totality of American strategic, industrial, and military power applied against a Japan that had overextended its conquests beyond any capacity to sustain them, because of the submarine campaign that strangled Japanese supply lines, because of the strategic bombing campaign that reduced Japanese industrial production, because of the amphibious campaign that took island after island until the B-29 bases were close enough to the home islands to make the bombing campaign devastatingly effective, but the Hellcat ended the Japanese Naval Air Force's capacity to contest American air superiority over the Pacific, and it ended it at the specific moment when that contest had been the last remaining instrument of Japanese strategic credibility, the last arena where Japan could still inflict costs on the American advance, sufficient to support the argument, maintained by the Japanese military faction in government through 1944 and into 1945, that continued resistance offered the prospect of a negotiated settlement rather than unconditional defeat. After the Philippine Sea, that argument had no carrier air force to give it weight. The Hellcat had taken the instrument Japan had built its Pacific strategy around: the fast carrier strike force, the elite pilot corps, the seamless integration of naval aviation with strategic naval thinking that Yamamoto had pioneered, and had destroyed its operational capability in engagements so one-sided that no honest accounting of them could support the continued claim that Japan retained the capacity to contest the outcome. After the Philippine Sea, Japan had no carrier air groups capable of offensive operations. After the Philippines campaign, Japan had no carrier fleet capable of delivering them. The Hellcat had taken the instrument Japan had built its Pacific strategy around and had rendered it spent in a series of engagements whose speed and completeness the men who designed the Zero in the late 1930s, confident in their aircraft's superiority, had not thought to make possible. The letters Japanese pilots wrote home after meeting it for the first time were honest in the way that men who fly for a living must be honest about what an aircraft can do, because the alternative to honesty about what an aircraft can do is dying in one. What they wrote was true. What it described was the end of something Japan had built over a decade and lost in a year, to an aircraft that had been designed specifically to end it, by men who had studied the problem with the analytical rigor and industrial resources of a country that Japan, in the specific calculus that Yamamoto had understood before Pearl Harbor and had failed to prevent, had chosen to make into its enemy.